Counting days by saints, seasons, and shadows. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine life in a medieval village. You do not have a clock. You do not have a calendar pinned to a wall. Instead, the rhythm of your days and years is carried not by machines or printed pages, but by bells, by seasons, by the festivals of saints and the shadows of the sun. Time in the Middle Ages moved differently, slower, more cyclical, more deeply tied to the land and the church. The simplest measure of time was daylight itself. Sunrise began the day's work, sunset ended it. The precise hour mattered little to most villagers. Instead, people spoke in general terms: dawn, noon, dusk, midnight. When more precision was needed, the sound of church bells offered it. Monasteries, in particular, divided the day into canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, compline. These hours structured prayer and, by extension, labor. Even peasants outside the monastery listened for bells, shaping their own routines around them. But beyond hours, there was the greater cycle of days, weeks, and months. Weeks were defined by Sunday, the day of rest and worship. Markets, too, followed weekly rhythms. Market day was often the only fixed point for peasants beyond church. Months, however, were harder to track. Few people owned written calendars, and even if they did, literacy limited their usefulness. Instead, months were remembered by saints' days, feasts, and natural signs. May began when hawthorn blossomed. Harvest month came when barley ripened. Winter arrived with the feast of St. Martin in November, when animals were slaughtered and salted for the cold. The saints' calendar was immense. Nearly every day was dedicated to one or more saints, and villagers remembered time through them. A wedding might be recalled as the Tuesday after St. Michael's Day. A death might be marked as in the week of St. Agnes. Some feasts were universal: the Nativity of Christ, Easter, Pentecost. Others were local, tied to the patron saint of a village or monastery. Together, they created a living calendar, not written on parchment, but spoken, sung, and enacted year after year. Seasonal labor reinforced this rhythm. Spring meant plowing and sowing. Summer meant weeding and haymaking. Autumn meant harvest. And winter meant mending, spinning, and storing. Time was measured less by abstract numbers than by tasks completed. A villager might say, "I will see you after the hay is cut," or "We shall meet once the apples are gathered." In this way, life was oriented towards cycles of necessity. Astronomical signs also mattered. Solstices and equinoxes were noted, sometimes with quiet ceremony. The lengthening and shortening of days were felt intimately by those whose work depended on light. Sundials marked time in monasteries and town squares, though cloudy skies often obscured them. In more rural places, the shadow of a pole in the ground or the height of the sun at noon sufficed. The movement of constellations guided navigation and, in some cases, agricultural practice. Even the phases of the moon influenced work. Full moons were useful for night travel or late harvesting. This cyclical calendar carried with it a different relationship to memory. Without printed almanacs, people remembered events by anchoring them to familiar markers. 3 winters ago, the year after the Great Frost, at the time of St. John's Fair, large events, famines, plagues, wars, were remembered as anchors for personal memory. A villager might recall a child's birth as occurring in the year of the bad harvest. In this way, private lives were interwoven with communal experience. The church provided further structure. Beyond daily bells, the liturgical year shaped the rhythm of society. Advent, Christmas, Lent, Easter, Pentecost. These were not abstract seasons but living cycles that altered diet, labor, and mood. Lent meant fasting and abstinence. Easter meant feasting and joy. Carnival marked the transition between the two, a brief eruption of festivity before restraint. Each feast was preceded by preparation and followed by rest, creating a constant ebb and flow that mirrored the agricultural year. Monasteries, again, were at the heart of this system. Their scriptoria preserved detailed calendars, recording not only saints' feasts, but astronomical observations. From these, almanacs were copied and circulated, influencing wider society. Monastic scholars measured solstices, tracked eclipses, and calculated the date of Easter with great care. Their work ensured that even in villages far from parchment, the rhythm of the heavens and the rhythm of saints were aligned. For peasants, though, the calendar was felt more than seen. Time was embodied in smell, sight, and touch. The scent of blossoms, the feel of wool sheared in May, the sight of migrating birds in autumn. Even illness followed rhythms. Ague in summer, coughs in winter. Life was not a straight line of numbered days, but a circle of recurring patterns, each year echoing the last. Of course, this system had its challenges. When precise coordination was required, between merchants in distant towns, or between lords arranging campaigns, discrepancies arose. Not all regions observed saints' days equally. The reckoning of New Year varied. In some places, it was marked in January, in others in March, and still others at Easter. These inconsistencies complicated record-keeping, though most villagers cared little. Their lives depended not on precision, but on predictability. The slow march of the medieval calendar, then, was less about dates on a page and more about rhythms of survival, belief, and community. It tied people to the land and to one another, embedding their lives within a cycle both natural and sacred. And yet, one wonders, what did it feel like to live in such a world, where time was not exact but approximate, not measured but felt? Did it create patience or frustration? Did the lack of precision free people or bind them more tightly to the unchanging cycles of work and worship, feasts, fasts, and the economy of the year? If the rhythm of bells and the cycle of saints marked daily life, then the true pulse of the medieval year was carried by feasts and fasts. To live in Europe in the Middle Ages was to live within a calendar not of your own making, but one structured by the church, the land, and the marketplace. The year was punctuated not only by seasons of labor, but by long cycles of restriction and release, scarcity and abundance, solemnity and celebration. Imagine a villager standing in a frosty November field. The feast of St. Martin has just passed, and with it, the season of slaughtering livestock for winter stores. Fresh meat is roasted, wine barrels opened, and the community gathers for a last brief abundance before the darkness of winter and the approach of Advent fasting. St. Martin's Day, once the unofficial beginning of winter in many regions, illustrates how feasts marked both spiritual and practical thresholds. They were not only holy days, but pivots of survival. Advent itself was a season of waiting and restraint, yet Christmas that followed was one of the great feasts of the year. The contrast was deliberate, reinforcing the rhythm of denial and reward. For peasants, this was a time when lords might grant extra food or alms, when families slaughtered their remaining geese, when fires burned brightly and songs echoed through halls. The festival year, in this way, was not abstract but deeply felt in stomachs, hearths, and homes. Beyond Christmas came Lent, the longest and harshest fast of the year. Meat, dairy, and often eggs were forbidden. The diet narrowed to fish, grains, and vegetables. For the wealthy, this meant inventive cookery. Almond milk substituted for cream, elaborate fish dishes replaced meat. For the poor, it often meant hunger. Yet Lent also shaped the economy. Demand for fish soared, leading to the rise of fisheries, fishmongers, and preserved fish trades. Salted herring from the North Sea, dried cod from the Atlantic, and freshwater catches from local rivers all entered the market as essential Lenten food. The fast thus tied theology to trade, shaping patterns of commerce as much as piety. Easter, when it arrived, was not only a religious climax, but a release from dietary constraint. Eggs, long absent, were boiled and dyed, bread baked rich with butter and milk, feasts spread with renewed abundance. The return of these foods after weeks of denial made their taste all the sweeter. Here again, the calendar bound body and soul, weaving joy into relief. Pentecost, too, carried its celebrations, games, fairs, and markets were often timed around it. In fact, many of the largest medieval fairs were aligned with feast days. St. Denis in Paris, St. Bartholomew in London, St. Giles in Edinburgh, all linked the sacred with the commercial. For merchants, fairs were the pulse of the economy, gathering traders from distant regions, exchanging cloth, spices, wool, and wine. For villagers, fairs were moments of spectacle, bringing entertainers, goods, and novelties unseen in their ordinary lives. Thus, the liturgical year doubled as an economic framework. Local saints' days further punctuated the year. In small villages, the patron saint's feast might be the most important event of the year, celebrated with processions, masses, and communal meals. These days strengthened community identity, binding people together in shared devotion and festivity. A wedding might be timed to coincide with such a feast, ensuring the community was already gathered. Even disputes were sometimes paused for the sake of a saint's day. Fast days were more numerous than modern imaginations allow. Beyond Lent, there were weekly fasts on Fridays, and in some places, on Wednesdays and Saturdays. Ember days, rogation days, vigils before feasts, all demanded abstinence of some kind. Altogether, nearly half the days of the medieval year were touched by fasting in some form. This had profound implications for agriculture and trade. The demand for fish and vegetable substitutes encouraged cultivation of certain crops, expansion of fisheries, and long-distance trade routes. Entire industries, from salt production to fish preservation, thrived because of the church's calendar. The calendar was not uniform. Practices varied by region, parish, and custom. Some villages observed local fasts unknown elsewhere. Some feasts were emphasized more in one land than another. Yet the overall pattern created a shared rhythm that extended across Europe. A merchant in Venice and a peasant in Flanders both fasted in Lent, both feasted at Easter, both paused for Christmas. This unity of rhythm, however varied in detail, gave medieval society a coherence that transcended borders. The calendar also structured labor obligations. Lords often timed rents, dues, and corvée labor around feast days. A tenant might owe payment by Michaelmas or at Martinmas. Markets opened on feast eves when crowds were already gathered. Legal sessions convened at fairs. The calendar was not merely spiritual. It was the skeleton on which economic, legal, and social life was hung. Even warfare bowed to the calendar. Campaigns often began after harvest, when provisions were plentiful, and paused in winter. Truces were sometimes declared for great feasts, especially Christmas and Easter. Pilgrimage, too, was tied to the calendar, with travelers departing after local feasts or aiming to arrive at shrines on specific holy days. Thus, the calendar moved armies and pilgrims alike, shaping movement across the continent. For the ordinary person, the experience of this rhythm was deeply physical. Hunger during Lent, relief at Easter, fatigue at harvest, joy at Christmas. Each season was felt in body and soul alike. The year was not an abstract circle of numbers, but a lived cycle of deprivation and reward, scarcity and plenty, solemnity and celebration. And yet, a question lingers. To live in a world so bound by feasts and fasts must have created a rhythm of expectation and endurance. But did it also create resentment? Did peasants weary of endless fasts, or nobles grow tired of the expenses of feasts? Or did the very weight of these obligations give meaning, anchoring lives in a cycle that, though demanding, was at least familiar and predictable? When the calendar faltered, extraordinary time in plagues, famines, and omens. Up to this point, the medieval calendar has seemed steady, cyclical, unchanging. Days marked by bells, weeks by Sundays, years by feasts and fasts. Yet life was never fully predictable. Into this orderly rhythm came disruptions, events so large, so overwhelming, that they could not be contained by saints' days or agricultural cycles. These were the extraordinary times. Plagues, famines, wars, and celestial wonders that bent the familiar calendar into strange shapes. Imagine a peasant trying to recall the year of his child's birth. He does not count back in numbers. Instead, he says, "It was the year after the great famine, or during the pestilence when the bells rang all day." Catastrophe became a calendar of its own, a grim marker for memory. Famine struck with cruel regularity. Bad weather, failed harvests, or disrupted trade could mean hunger across entire regions. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, for example, left Northern Europe struggling for survival. Torrential rains ruined crops, fodder rotted, and cattle died of disease. Bread became scarce, prices soared, and even lords felt the sting. Ordinary villagers measured time by scarcity. The long hungry spring before rye sprouted, the desperate autumn when grain ran out. Such years stood apart from the normal cycle of sowing and reaping, remembered as seasons of want that warped the ordinary rhythm of life. Plague, too, reshaped time. The Black Death of the mid-14th century did not simply kill. It altered how people experienced days and months. Burials occurred so frequently that feast days lost their familiar joy, replaced by mourning. Parish calendars, usually filled with saints' celebrations, became instead records of the dead. Monks who had once marked canonical hours now rang bells for funerals. The regular cycle of fasting and feasting was overwhelmed by the urgency of survival. In some places, processions of penitents filled the streets, creating new, extraordinary days outside the normal liturgical rhythm. For survivors, memory itself became reordered. Before the pestilence and after the pestilence became the ultimate markers of time. Wars likewise reshaped the calendar. Campaign seasons often began after harvest, but prolonged conflicts, like the 100 Years' War, stretched for decades, distorting local rhythms. Villages near battle zones timed their lives not by saints' feasts, but by the arrival of armies, the passage of soldiers, or the season of raids. Chroniclers frequently noted truces called for Christmas or Easter, brief respites when even war bowed to the calendar of the church. Yet in war-torn regions, the steady march of feast days was often drowned out by drums and fire. Celestial events added another layer of extraordinary time. Eclipses, comets, and unusual conjunctions of planets unsettled medieval minds. Chroniclers wrote of peasants gathering in fields, staring upward, murmuring prayers as the sun dimmed. Such events became reference points. The year of the great eclipse, or when the fiery star appeared in the sky. Astrologers interpreted these signs as omens, tying them to wars, famines, or plagues to come. For villagers, the events broke the usual flow of days, leaving behind memories etched as vividly as feasts or fasts. Weather, too, could disrupt the calendar. Harsh winters delayed planting, late frosts killed blossoms, summer storms flattened crops. Time in the Middle Ages was fragile, dependent on conditions beyond human control. In years of strange weather, the ordinary sequence of saints' feasts and labors felt distorted. Festivals still occurred, but their tone shifted, less joyful, more anxious, as survival overshadowed ritual. In these extraordinary times, communities often turned to processions, prayers, and fasts outside the usual cycle. Rogation days, already set aside for blessing fields, could be intensified in years of crisis. Special masses were held, saints invoked, relics paraded through streets. These acts created new sacred days, improvised in response to disruption, temporary insertions into the calendar of survival. Yet, even in disruption, the ordinary calendar remained a framework. Famines were still measured by the turning of seasons. People prayed for a good harvest next St. John's Day, or recalled that hunger had lasted until after St. Michael's. Plagues were still counted in weeks and months, marked by saints' feasts even as those feasts turned into days of mourning. The extraordinary, in other words, did not erase the ordinary. Instead, it layered over it, reshaping memory while leaving the structure intact. For the individual, the experience of extraordinary time was deeply emotional. The cycle of deprivation and reward, so central to feast and fast, became distorted. In famine years, Lent blurred into daily hunger, with no Easter feast to follow. In plague years, Christmas might arrive with empty chairs at the table. In war years, fairs might not be held, saints' processions canceled, markets silent. The very predictability of the medieval calendar made these disruptions all the more shocking, because they broke a rhythm that people relied on for meaning. Extraordinary time also shaped collective memory. Villages rebuilt their histories around catastrophes. Families remembered ancestors as those who lived through the hunger or who died in the pestilence. Parish records, when they survive, show gaps during these years, silence in place of steady notation. The disruption became visible in the very absence of continuity. Yet perhaps the most striking feature of extraordinary time was its eventual absorption back into the ordinary. After famine came harvest, after plague came marriage and birth, after war came fairs and feasts again. The calendar resumed, but never without scars. A generation later, people still spoke of the year of the hunger or the pestilence years, weaving catastrophe into the cycle of memory. Extraordinary time thus never truly left. It became a permanent marker within the slow march of the medieval year. And here we pause on a thought. If ordinary time was meant to provide stability, and extraordinary time revealed fragility, how did medieval people reconcile the two? Did the constant possibility of disruption make the ordinary calendar feel more precious? Or did it remind them that all order was temporary, subject to forces beyond their control? From cycles to clocks, the quiet shift toward modern time. The medieval calendar, as we have seen, was a rhythm of bells, saints, and seasons. Days were measured in work and prayer, weeks in Sundays, years in harvests and feasts. It was a system that bound people to cycles, circular, repetitive, and reassuring. Yet, Over time, this system began to bend slowly, almost imperceptibly, towards something more linear. The medieval world, so steeped in the cyclical, gradually prepared the ground for the modern notion of time, numbered, measured, and precise. The shift began with bells and sundials, already present in monasteries and towns. Monks needed precision for the canonical hours, and their care in marking them influenced wider society. Villagers might not care whether terce began at 9 o'clock, but they heard the bell that rang at that hour. Over centuries, these bells carved a habit of expectation, time not only as morning or afternoon, but as something broken into measurable portions. Mechanical clocks marked the next step. By the late 13th and early 14th centuries, towns such as Milan, Norwich, and Salisbury began installing large public clocks. These were not pocket watches, but great contraptions of gears and weights, often placed in church towers. They did not always tell the hour as we think of it, but they chimed at intervals, marking time more evenly than the changing length of daylight hours. Townspeople began to shape their routines not only by bells of prayer, but by mechanical sound, each strike of the hammer reminding them that time could be measured in equal slices. The arrival of these clocks slowly altered how people thought of work. In monasteries, discipline became even stricter. Prayers had to align with clock chimes, not merely with the movement of the sun. In towns, markets began to open and close according to the ringing of the clock tower. Even craftsmen found their labor measured differently. Orders promised by such an hour, rather than merely by tomorrow. The slow march of hours, once fluid, was now given structure by iron and wheel. Printed calendars reinforced the shift. With the spread of the printing press in the 15th century, almanacs and calendars could be produced in quantity. Farmers, merchants, and households now had access to printed tables of saints' days, moon phases, and agricultural advice. What had once been preserved orally or through memory was fixed in ink. A villager no longer needed to remember that sowing should happen around St. George's Day. He could read it in a cheap booklet. Memory began to give way to record, tradition to text. At the same time, the reckoning of New Year became more standardized. For centuries, different regions had marked it variously in January, March, or Easter. But with the adoption of the Gregorian calendar in 1582 by Catholic Europe and later by Protestant lands, New Year's Day fixed itself more firmly to January 1st. The year, once flexible and varied, became uniform. Across much of Europe, the cycle turned together, aligning trade, diplomacy, and daily life under one reckoning. Even the way people spoke about time began to shift. In the medieval period, memory was often phrased in cycles. 3 harvests ago, the Easter after the pestilence. But with the spread of record-keeping, parish registers, tax rolls, legal documents, events became anchored to numbered years. Births and deaths were written as in the year of our Lord 1432, rather than during the famine. Time grew increasingly linear, stretching forward from creation, anchored by Christ, and reaching toward an end. Yet, for all this, the old cycles never vanished completely. Villagers still lived by the seasons, still tied work to sowing and reaping. The saints' calendar, too, remained vibrant. Feast days and fasts continued to mark life well into the modern era. Even in cities with clocks, people still spoke of market day and harvest time. The transition was not abrupt but layered. Cycles remained, but within them ticked a growing sense of hours, dates, and numbered years. This layering can be seen in how people balanced calendars. A merchant might schedule delivery by Michaelmas, while also noting it as the 29th of September in the year 1467. Both systems coexisted, the cyclical saint's feast and the linear number. For generations, medieval people lived in this duality, at once bound to repetition and nudged toward precision. The shift toward modern time also carried cultural consequences. With hours measured, labor could be timed more strictly. Lords might demand longer service. Towns might regulate shop hours. Monasteries might tighten discipline. Freedom to work until dusk gave way to obligations until the bell. Time became not only a rhythm, but a measure of obligation and control. For ordinary people, this change was slow, almost invisible. They still rose with the sun and slept with the dark. They still remembered events by harvests and famines. But gradually, a new sense crept in. That time was not only something felt and seen, but something counted, measured, and written. And so, as the medieval calendar yielded to clocks and print, a new vision of time emerged. The endless circle of feast and fast began to straighten into a line, moving from past to present to future with increasing clarity. This was the quiet revolution, not the clash of armies or the edicts of kings, but the steady ticking of gears, the printing of almanacs, the ringing of bells. As we leave behind the medieval calendar, a final thought remains. What did it feel like to stand at the threshold of this change? Did villagers notice the creeping presence of measured hours, or did they still live within the comfort of cycles? Was the new precision a liberation, allowing trade and record to flourish, or was it a burden, binding life to numbers instead of seasons? The question lingers, unanswered, much as the bells of monasteries and clocks once overlapped in the medieval air. Did time itself change, or only the way humans chose to reckon it?